Welcome to the Explainer. You know, when you send a quick email, stream a movie on your couch, or maybe even execute a complex financial trade, you probably imagine all that data just zipping through thin air, right? Bouncing off high-tech satellites and seamlessly landing on a device on the exact opposite side of the planet. We always talk about the cloud as if our entire digital lives are just floating gracefully above us. But the reality of our global digital economy is actually far more grounded, far more physical, and honestly, it's a little unsettling when you realize just how incredibly fragile the whole shebang actually is. Today, we're going to pull back the curtain on the hidden, physical infrastructure that literally makes the modern world run.
Okay, let's dive into this, starting with this absolutely fantastic quote from former U.S. Navy officer Admiral James Stavridis. I love this because it perfectly shatters that whole myth of a wireless world. The geopolitical and economic stakes of our global connectivity, they aren't floating in orbit. They are quite literally resting in the mud at the very bottom of the ocean.
99%. Just let that number sink in for a second. That single, staggering percentage is the undeniable reality of our global network. Roughly 99% of all international data traffic, and we're talking about everything, including over 10 trillion US dollars in daily financial transactions, travels underwater, not through the air, not through the vacuum of space, underwater.
Now, you might be wondering, well, why not satellites? Isn't space supposed to be the future of everything? To understand why the internet stubbornly lives in the ocean, we have to look at the undeniable math. There are some really harsh technical and economic realities as to why satellites simply cannot be the saviors of the global internet, and it all boils down to capacity, physics, and hard cost.
To put this massive gap into perspective, let's look at Taiwan's infrastructure. They rely on submarine cables for an absolutely massive 83 terabits per second of capacity. Now, what's their emergency satellite capacity? A microscopic 2 gigabits per second. That means, and this is crazy, even if a country had full exclusive access to an entire constellation of over 7,000 Starlink satellites, that combined capacity would still be less than what a single modern submarine cable can carry. It's not even a close contest. Satellite capacity is just orders of magnitude too small to ever replace undersea cables.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how the choice between cables and satellites is entirely dictated by undeniable physics and economics. Take latency, for example, that annoying delay before a signal reaches its destination. A signal pinging a geostationary satellite has to travel 72,000 kilometers up into space and all the way back down. That creates a 650 millisecond delay. A fiber cable, just 120 milliseconds. And then look at the cost per megabit per second. You're looking at $14,500 for cables versus a whopping $740,000 for satellite. The economics are just completely one-sided in favor of the ocean floor.
And if we want to get into the sheer physics of signal loss, imagine injecting a 2-watt signal into a fiber-optic cable in New York. You're going to get about 1 milliwatt of that signal when it finally reaches London. That's pretty efficient. But if you radiate that exact same 2-watt signal into space toward a satellite dish, well, because of spherical spreading loss, basically the radio waves scatter outward in all directions like you're blowing up a giant balloon, you end up receiving something on the order of 10 to the power of negative 13 watts. It proves without a doubt why shooting light through a glass tube is infinitely more power efficient than just beaming radio waves out into the void of orbit.
So the economics and the physics totally dictate that we use cables. Case closed, right? But that brings us to the physical reality of the infrastructure itself. We're trusting the entirety of modern human civilization to this fragile spiderweb that's just kind of laid across the most unforgiving environment on planet Earth. Let's shift our focus to the really stark contrast between the vastness of the ocean and the ridiculously minuscule size of the lifelines running right through it.
And this brilliantly illustrates exactly what I mean. Just look at the jaw-dropping global scale of the submarine telecommunications network. There are hundreds of these cables spanning the globe, connecting almost every single coastal nation, from New York to London, from California to Tokyo. This right here, this is the true map of the internet. It is a highly engineered, globally sprawling nervous system.
But here is the ultimate paradox of scale. Let's zoom in on a cross-section of one of these actual cables. For most of its lonely journey across the deep ocean, the entire cable is only about as wide as a standard garden hose, literally. And the actual optical fibers, the part in the very center carrying those trillions of dollars in daily trades and all of your streaming data, they are roughly the diameter of a human hair. Sure, they're wrapped in layers of steel wire, copper tubes, and plastic to protect them, but the core itself is microscopically thin.
Now, you might be thinking, well, just make the cables way thicker. Actually, scratch that, we can't. Terrestrial networks on land can push insane amounts of bandwidth by bundling thousands of fiber pairs together because, well, electrical power is everywhere on land. But submarine cables are severely limited. They max out at roughly 24 fiber pairs. Why? Because of the extreme physical challenge of pushing high-voltage electricity across thousands of miles of ocean just to power the little amplifiers that keep the light signal moving forward. Because of that, subsea capacity is, and will absolutely remain, a very scarce asset.
Which brings us to a frankly terrifying reality: how easily this incredibly essential, hair-thin, power-limited infrastructure can be totally disrupted. Let's transition into the threat matrix. What actually breaks the internet? You might have heard the fun internet rumors about shark bites, but the real threats are categorized into two main groups: human activity and the raw, unpredictable power of nature.
So the crucial point is that everyday, mundane human negligence is by far the biggest threat. Look at this. Fishing vessels account for 38% of all cable faults, and dropped anchors make up another 25%. This completely debunks that famous myth of shark bites, which honestly account for virtually zero damage today. The vast majority of disruptions come from simple human negligence. It's just ships dropping their anchors in shallow waters and accidentally severing the literal lifeblood of the global economy. Oops.
But while human errors in shallow water are the most common cause of damage, the threats lurking in the deep sea, they are far, far more devastating. Natural disasters like submarine earthquakes and undersea landslides only account for a small percentage of faults, but they are uniquely terrifying. Why? Because an earthquake doesn't just neatly snip one cable. It can trigger a massive underwater mud avalanche that severs multiple cables all at the same time, completely crippling entire regional networks and totally overwhelming the system's built-in backups. And let me be clear, these aren't just theoretical vulnerabilities cooked up in a lab. Let's move to and see how this builds into devastating real-world consequences. We have terrifying, well-documented historical blackouts that prove exactly what happens when the cord breaks.
Walking through history here, we can clearly see the extreme physical fragility of this network. Back in 2008, a ship mooring accident in bad weather severed cables in the Middle East and India. That single accident left up to 75 million people with virtually no internet for days. In 2011, the devastating 8.9 magnitude earthquake in Japan disabled at least 8 submarine cables all at once. And more recently in 2022, a massive underwater volcanic eruption severed the single cable connecting the island nation of Tonga. That plunged the entire country into a catastrophic total blackout, leaving them entirely isolated from the rest of the world. No communication, no banking, nothing.
We rely on the internet for absolutely everything today, from our critical hospital records to our global financial markets, right down to our personal connections with friends and family. Yet all of it, this entire vast digital existence, ultimately relies on the sheer physical integrity of a hair-thin piece of glass sitting quietly in the cold mud at the bottom of the ocean. It is an absolute miracle of modern engineering, for sure, but it's one that is constantly under threat from the careless drag of a fishing net or the violent shifting of the Earth's crust. So as we continue to blindly build our lives up there in the cloud, it leaves us with one incredibly critical question to think about. What happens when the next anchor drops?